This is not what you expect. In a period of time where the traditional view of the 600cc sports bike from the 90s and noughties is seemingly dying, Honda has re-entered the ring with something that technically shouldn't exist. Yamaha has already killed off the R6 in favour of the R7, Kawasaki has killed off the ZX6R for the Ninja 650, and you can be sure that those won't be the only ones to fall victim to the new European emissions regulations. Bike manufacturers are moving towards having a big 1000cc superbike, and then their mid-range sports bikes are moving away from being more track-focused and attempting to be more usable on the road. Whereas Honda have surprised us a bit. Because you see, they've actually been fairly inconsistent over the years with their smaller CBRs. Back in 2011, we had the CBR 600F, which only lasted 2 years, and the Hornet that it was based on was killed off pretty quickly too. It was then replaced by the CBR 650F, which only lasted about a year. Meanwhile, the racier CBR 600RR was also killed off for good. We had to wait a couple of years until we saw what they had up their sleeves. And it's this thing, which is essentially a cross between the two. Track-friendly rather than track-focused, but less touring and more sports. But is it the best of both worlds, or is it the worst of both worlds? Well, the first thing to point out is that the styling is going to be a bit hit and miss for some people. As from the front, it looks sporty and mean like a Fireblade, but at the back you've got a rather stubby but functional pillion seat that sits lower than the old RR but is still split into two rather than how it was on the F, which makes it look a little imbalanced when seen from the side, but I have to say it's starting to grow on me, and I'd had this thing less than 10 minutes before I parked up and had people turning up and complimenting me on it. In fact, while I was out filming with it, I called our mechanic Bertie to talk about our Kawasaki project, and even then had someone pulling up to tell me that it's fire, which I assumed was a good thing. I've even had a few people confusing it for a Fireblade from the front. The thing that strikes me though is that despite the styling, I was still expecting something a little more sports tourer-like, and as you'll soon find out, this isn't that. So let's take it out on the road and see whether the ride truly matches the looks. I've come to the back roads of Cheshire because I feel that that's where this bike truly belongs. It's a lovely warm day, it's end of summer, not quite autumn yet, the leaves are just starting to turn brown and fall, and I have a big bright red sports bike to play with. Now I'm going to keep repeating myself when I say sports bike because I think Honda hasn't done that good a job at marketing this thing, to be honest. I think a lot of people are still hung up on the idea that this is a replacement for the old CBR 650F and the 600F before that. They think that it's a sports tourer. But one of the first things you realise when you jump on this thing is that it's absolutely not. This is a supersport bike. And it feels quite strange jumping on a brand new one of these in 2022 because that category is kind of dying. In actual fact, a little behind the scenes feature here, we're filming today because this is where the weather is about to change. From today onwards it's going to be pouring down nearly every day, which doesn't bode too well for me taking this thing back to Honda next week and having to ride on the motorway in pouring rain, but it also doesn't bode too well for Tuesday, which is when we're going to Alton Park to film with the Yamaha R6 on my birthday, in fact, because it's actually a goodbye video to the R6 because most manufacturers are killing off their old supersport bikes in favour of something a little bit different. In fact, Honda themselves are replacing the old Hornet with potentially a twin-engine bike. Now, the idea of a Hornet, the idea being, you know, it has a sting in its tail, being a twin-engine, kind of feels a bit sacrilege, to be honest. And when it came to riding this thing, I thought this was going to be... I'll just slow down for the horse. I thought this thing was going to be a twin as well. But it's not. This is still a 650cc four-cylinder engine, and it'll rev to 12,000 as well. In fact, Honda claim that the peak power is around 12,000 revs. I'm not so sure about that. I feel that the power is actually slightly lower down in the rev range, and it runs out of puff a little bit when it gets higher up the revs, which is not actually a bad thing, because like with the V-twin engine, not the V-twin, the twin engine bikes, it feels a little bit more usable on the road when the power is lower down. So this thing actually feels fantastic on the roads. I'm just going to slow down a little bit here because we're riding through a village. That's the sign we're looking for, because now we can squeeze the loud maker a little bit, but not too much, because I still need to concentrate on what I'm saying. But that's the thing, this thing does feel really usable on the roads, even on roads which have no line in the middle, so you don't necessarily know if there's a tractor coming your way. It feels sporty, it feels fun. In fact, it's exciting. You know, every day when I'm sort of getting ready to jump on this thing, I'm excited to get on it, which is not something you necessarily expect from a Honda. But Honda seem to be having a little bit of a resurgence at the moment. The Fireblade is kind of like the Fireblade of old, and then they've come out of the woodwork with this CBR 650R, which is a proper sports bike again. I know I'm repeating myself, but I need to, because I need to get that message across to you. This is a proper sports bike. Now this is the 2022 model. There are a few little improvements, not many to be honest. It's got the shower forks there, but that's about it really. But the thing is really, it's kind of a case of, well, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Honda have realised that they've got a good bike here, and they haven't changed that much. They've introduced a few little, you know, extra details which make the bike a bit better, but they haven't sort of rewritten the whole formula. They realised they got it right, and they've just stuck with it. That's not to say it's perfect. I do have a few little things that I could probably say need improving. One thing is the tank. Now this is actually a very slim tank. In fact, it actually feels a little bit like a twin jumping on this because it feels so slim. Now that means that it's probably been done to keep the weight a little bit lower down, because some people have complained about this being a little bit top heavy. I haven't felt that, but then I am on the shorter side. But one thing that it has meant is that I've noticed that this eats through fuel as you're going along. Now this is Euro 5 emissions compliant, but it still seems to get through a whole lot of fuel. Now it's not that big a deal really. I mean, it doesn't cost that much to fill up, but we are technically in a fuel crisis right now when I'm filming this, or just an energy crisis in general. So it means that when you're eating through a lot of fuel, you're essentially burning through money, but that's what motorbikes do, I guess. At least you're having fun doing it, which I need to reiterate again, this is a seriously fun bike. And in a factual fact, jumping on this, it feels a little bit like going back in time. I mean, I'm repeating myself, but to do this in 2022, to jump on a brand new 600 Supersport bike and ride it around like I have been doing today, not while I'm presenting because I need to keep my concentration levels. Now, one thing I do think that this thing could do with is a quick shifter. Some of the bikes that this is being compared to on the market all have them, but they're generally more expensive. This does have a slipper clutch on it, and the clutch itself is very light, so I'm already in 6th gear, so I can't demonstrate that to you, but changing gear is very easy on this thing, so it's not that big a deal to use the clutch and change gear in the old-fashioned way, but as we go on and with this bike and it adds more improvements over the years, little nod to the other bikers out on the road. How you doing, sir? And to you too. A quick shifter would be something that is a nice addition to this, and that might be something that Honda is keeping in reserve for as they go along with this bike, because I hope that this bike lasts a little bit longer than the last two iterations. The CBR 650F only lasted a year, I believe, and the CBR 600F only lasted about 2 or 3 years, even though the Hornet that it was based on lasted a little bit longer than that. This seems like it's a bike that's got a little bit more longevity in it. It's one that's been built incredibly well, as you'd expect from a Honda, of course. Honda build quality is always good, and their reliability is always good. But it does feel a little bit like this is the formula that Honda are going to stick to for a while now. And I don't think Honda is particularly going to rush to try and get different iterations of this bike out, because, as I say, it's kind of in a class of its own at the moment. This doesn't really compare to the Yamaha R7, it doesn't really compare to the Ducati Supersport 950S, it doesn't really compare to the Kawasaki Ninja 650, it doesn't really compare to anything that's brand new on the market. It compares to things that are slightly older on the market, and compared to them, it kind of holds up. Now, I will say that there's not a huge amount of difference between this and the CBR 650F and the old 600F either. In fact, I had the 600F for a little while, I had it for just over a year, and I loved that thing. I really enjoyed it, and there's not a whole lot more that has been added to this since that was out on the market. That was 10 years ago, and we're still using, you know, LCD displays, albeit a nice, simple, clear one, nothing like the mess that Yamaha put on the MT-09. But the technology of this thing doesn't feel that much different to that bike, and obviously now you can probably get one of those bikes for 3 or 4 grand, whereas you're expecting to pay 8.5 for this one. So maybe or maybe not, you're not justified in getting this compared to some of the older models. But what I will say for this compared to those is that this is truly a cross between the the double R, I should say, and the F. It's called the 650R on purpose. It's not full race replica like the old CBR 600 RRs are, like they were meant to be race replicas of some of their racing supersport bikes. This is a little bit more civilized, a little bit more comfy than that. But, and I'm going to say it one more time, this is not a sports tourer, it is a sports bike. We need to get around that. We need to draw a line under it. It is just a sports bike. And I don't mean just a sports bike, it's a fantastic sports bike. But get away from this notion of it being a sports tourer. Oh, speaking of the weather changing, here comes the rain. Well, I guess that's the end of our on-road segment, but at least that means I get to say, back to the studio. The CBR 650R has thrown me a little bit, because it feels like Honda has tried to create a new version of the old CBR 600F of the noughties, and that's just not a market that seems to exist anymore. And for the last 15 years or so, whenever you say you've got a Honda, you'd be met with a look that screams, "You're a bit boring, aren't you?" But considering the other options that are available at the moment, and also the resurgence of the Fireblade, it seems like Honda is now the exciting option, which I'm happy about, but doesn't quite seem right. And if you look at the other news outlets, they're actually comparing this to the Ducati Supersport, but I can't for the life of me figure out why. The Supersport is fantastic, but it has a 937cc twin engine and costs 15 grand, and the Honda is a 650cc 4-cylinder engine and costs 8.5 grand. They're very different machines, and even though the Ducati technically has a higher peak horsepower, this feels a lot sportier and track friendly, without, as I mentioned, being track focused. So much so that this is perfect for someone who still wants that proper supersport experience. And frankly, there's not a lot of competition anymore. But for me, I'm left kind of missing the more sports touring focus of previous models. But either way, well done Honda, because you knocked it out the park. I'm just glad that I got to ride it before summer ends and most of these end up on the trickle charger in people's garages. But even though biking season is technically coming to an end, that is definitely not the end for road tests. We have a lot more content coming up, so I will see you all in the next one.